Sometimes people become so focused on surviving life that they never stop to heal from what life did to them. And eventually, unhealed pain starts affecting the way you think, the way you trust, the way you love, and even the way you see yourself. So today, we're talking about healing the heart you never talk about. I think one of the saddest things about life is how many people silently carry pain every single day while pretending they're perfectly fine. And the truth is, a lot of pain doesn't look like pain on the outside. Some people still laugh, they still go to work, they still post online, and some still show up for everybody else. But internally, they're exhausted. And I think a lot of people learn how to hide pain instead of process it. And some people were never taught how to express emotions in a healthy way. So instead of healing, they suppress it. Instead of talking, they isolate. Instead of processing pain, they just bury it. And eventually, those buried emotions start affecting the way people think, the way they trust, the way they love, and even the way they see themselves. A lot of people are still carrying heartbreak they never healed from. But not just relationship heartbreak, but disappointment from people they trusted. Betrayal changes people, especially when the betrayal comes from someone you loved or believed in. And I think betrayal creates a different kind of pain because it makes people question everything. It makes people question, was any of it real? Can I trust people again? Was I just not enough? And sometimes people become emotionally guarded, but not because they want to be cold, but because they're just scared of feeling that pain again. Then there's the abandonment. And I don't think people realize how deeply abandonment can affect somebody emotionally. That being left, being ignored, being forgotten, even feeling unwanted. That type of pain can stay with people for years. Sometimes abandonment happens physically, and sometimes it happens emotionally. You can be around people every day and still feel emotionally alone. And I think emotional neglect is something a lot of people don't really talk about. Some people grew up in a environment where emotions were ignored completely. You know, maybe no one asked how they felt. Maybe that vulnerability space wasn't there. Maybe survival was the priority. instead of emotional health. So people learn how to survive emotionally instead of heal emotionally. And eventually survival mode becomes normal. And a lot of people are walking around functioning like that, but they're still emotionally wounded. And childhood pain, especially, has a way of following people into adulthood because unresolved pain doesn't just disappear with time. Some people become adults, still carrying rejection from childhood, still carrying insecurity, still carrying emotional wounds nobody ever helped them process. And the dangerous part about that is people can look completely okay while struggling deeply. Some of the strongest people you know may be secretly fighting battles that they never speak about. That's why I think people should be more gentle with each other sometimes because you never fully know what someone is carrying internally. And I think one of the hardest things about emotional pain is that invisible wounds don't always receive visible support. People notice physical injuries immediately, but those emotional wounds, a lot of people suffer through those silently. And of course, over time, that silent pain starts changing people. Some people become distant. Some people become angry. Some people become numb. Some even stop trusting. And even some stop opening up emotionally. Not because they don't care, but because pain changed the way that they protect themselves. And I think healing really begins the moment people stop pretending they're unaffected by what hurt them. Because honesty is the beginning of healing, not protection, not pretending. I think one of the hardest parts about unhealed pain is how quietly it changes people over time. Not overnight, but slowly, piece by piece. Sometimes people don't even realize they've changed emotionally until they look up one day and barely recognize themselves. Because pain has a way of building emotional walls, and a lot of those walls aren't created out of hate, they're created out of protection. After enough disappointment, after enough betrayal, after enough emotional exhaustion, people stop opening up the same way. Some people become guarded because they got tired of being hurt. Some people stop trusting because every time they trusted somebody, they ended up disappointed. And I think people misunderstand guarded individuals sometimes. They call them cold, they call them distant. They say that they are hard to love. But sometimes those people aren't cold at all. Sometimes they're just protecting wounds nobody ever helped them heal. And unhealed pain affects relationships in ways people don't always talk about. Sometimes people push others away before they can get close, not because they don't care, but because vulnerability feels dangerous. It becomes easier to keep emotional distance than to risk heartbreak again. And I think a lot of people secretly struggle with the fear of disappointment, fear of giving their all and still getting hurt, the fear of trusting the wrong people, fear of being emotionally exposed. So instead of risking emotional pain again, they just shut down. And eventually emotional survival becomes normal. Some people become so used to protecting themselves that they stop allowing genuine connections with people. And then there's the overthinking. Unhealed pain creates a lot of overthinkers because once someone has been hurt deeply, their mind starts trying to prevent future pain. So now they're analyzing everything, you know, every text, every conversation, every change in energy, every small disappointment. Not because they want to, but because pain taught them to stay emotionally alert, right? And honestly, that's exhausting. Always preparing for disappointment, always expecting something to go wrong emotionally. And sometimes pain creates anger too. No, not loud anger all the time, sometimes quiet anger, the kind that sits underneath people's personality, the kind that makes people impatient, emotionally unavailable, irritated, disconnected. And a lot of times that anger is really unresolved hurt underneath the surface. I also think unhealed pain can create self-sabotage. Sometimes people destroy healthy situations because unhealthy experiences convince them that peace won't last anyway. So when something finally feels safe, they get to panicking, you know, because chaos becomes familiar. And I think that that's important to talk about because a lot of people blame themselves for behaviors they never fully understood emotionally. Sometimes people aren't toxic, they're just wounded. Sometimes people aren't hard to love, they're afraid to trust. Sometimes people don't struggle with love, they struggle with feeling safe emotionally. And I think people deserve grace while they're trying to heal. You know, not excuses for unhealthy behavior, but understanding. Because emotional wounds, they're real. And if pain is never addressed, it eventually starts speaking through behavior. You know, that's why healing matters. Not just for peace internally, but for the way we treat ourselves and the way we treat other people also. I think one of the most exhausting things people do emotionally is pretend they're okay when they're really not. And after a while, pretending becomes automatic. You learn how to smile while you're drained, laugh when you're hurting, show up for people while emotionally running on empty. And eventually people get so good at hiding pain that nobody realizes they're struggling at all. And I think a lot of people wear emotional masks every day. Not because they want to lie, but because vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Sometimes people are scared of being judged. You know, sometimes they're scared nobody will understand. Sometimes they're scared that opening up that'll make them look weak. So instead of speaking honestly, they suppress everything. And the dangerous thing about that emotional suppression is that buried emotions don't disappear. They they stay there. And over time that emotional weight starts affecting people mentally, emotionally, of course, and even physically. You know, some people stay constantly busy because silence forces them to confront emotions they've been trying to avoid. So they distance themselves, they work, they stay on social media, you know, relationships, the partying, you know, constant movement, anything to avoid sitting alone with their thoughts. Because when life finally gets quiet, everything they buried emotionally starts resurfacing. And honestly, a lot of people are emotionally tired, not physically tired, emotionally tired. Tired of pretending, tired of carrying pressure, tired of acting strong, tired of hiding struggles nobody knows about. And I think fake strength is one of the most dangerous things people normalize because people eventually stop asking for help completely. They convince themselves, I'll handle it alone. I don't want to burden anybody. I just need to keep going. But carrying everything alone can slowly break people internally. Some people have become so emotionally guarded that they don't even know how to express what they truly feel anymore. They've spent so much time suppressing emotions that numbness starts feeling normal. And emotional numbness is dangerous because sometimes people mistake numbness for healing. But not feeling anything isn't healing. Avoiding pain isn't healing. Pretending you're unaffected isn't healing. Healing requires honesty. And honesty is uncomfortable sometimes because it forces people to admit I've been hurt, that I'm struggling, that I'm exhausted, and that I'm not okay. And that level of honesty takes courage, especially in a world where so many people feel pressure to always appear strong. But I think one of the strongest things a person can do emotionally is to stop pretending, because healing can't begin until honesty does. And I think people they need a space where they don't feel pressure to perform strong or appear to be strong all the time. A place where they can finally breathe emotionally, a place where they can finally be real. And honesty, that's the part of why this podcast exists. I think healing is one of the hardest journeys a person can take, because healing forces you to face yourself honestly. Not the version people see online, not the version you pretend to be, not the version built for survival, the real version, the hurt version, the exhausted version, the emotionally overwhelmed version. And I think a lot of people want peace without confronting the pain that they've been carrying. But healing doesn't work that way. Healing requires honesty. It requires people to finally admit that I'm hurt, that that changed me, that I've been carrying this for a long time. And honestly, I think that level of emotional honesty takes real courage, because healing isn't always pretty. Sometimes healing looks like sitting alone with your thoughts. Sometimes healing looks like carrying or crying privately. Sometimes healing looks like therapy, looks like prayer, looks like journaling, looks like discipline, rest, setting boundaries, learning how to communicate differently. And sometimes healing simply starts with slowing down long enough to acknowledge what you feel emotionally, what you truly feel emotionally. One of the biggest misconceptions about healing is that people expect it to be that they expect it to happen quickly, right? But healing is a process, not a switch you can just switch on and off. Some days you feel strong, some days old emotions resurface, some days you feel like you're growing, other days you feel emotionally stuck again. And honestly, that's normal. Growth isn't always linear. I also think healing requires accountability, not just blaming the people who hurt you, but also being honest about how pain may have changed you. Because sometimes wounded people unintentionally wound other people too. And healing means becoming aware of those patterns instead of ignoring them. I think healing also means learning how to forgive yourself. A lot of people carry guilt, they carry regret, shame, embarrassment, past mistakes that still mentally punish them, you know. And eventually people start identifying themselves by what hurt them or by what they survived. But pain is not your identity. Trauma is not your identity. Your worst moment is not your identity. And I think people deserve the opportunity to become more than what happened to them emotionally. That's why healing matters. Not because it erases the past, but because it prevents the past from controlling your future. Protecting your peace becomes important too. Learning when to walk away, learning when to rest, learning when to say no, learning who deserves access to your energy emotionally, because healing sometimes requires separation from environments that constantly reopen emotional wounds. And honestly, I think one of the strongest things a person can say is, I want better for myself emotionally, not perfection, not pretending, just growth and real growth. People need to hear this more. You know, you can be strong and still need healing. You can be healing and still have difficult days, have those rough days. You can be growing and still be a work in process, because healing isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole again. I think a lot of people have spent so much time surviving emotionally that they forgot healing is even possible. Some people become so focused on protecting their heart that they stop allowing themselves to truly feel anything at all. And honestly, I understand that life can hurt people deeply. Like I said, disappointment, the betrayal, the rejection, the abandonment, the pressure, the silent struggles. Those things, they leave emotional scars. But I also think healing begins the moment people stop pretending they're affected by what hurt them. Not when life becomes perfect, not when every wound disappears overnight, but when somebody finally says, yeah, that hurt me. Yeah, I've been struggling. And yes, I'm tired of carrying this alone. And I think there's strength in that kind of honesty, real strength, because healing takes courage. Facing yourself honestly takes courage. Choosing growth after pain takes courage. And if nobody told you lately, you deserve peace too. You deserve healing too. You deserve the opportunity to become more than the pain you've experienced. And maybe healing doesn't happen all at once. Maybe It happens conversation by conversation, decision by decision, day by day. But every honest step forward still matters. This is Black Man Unfiltered. Real voice, real truth, real growth.